et faire des commentaires. Sorry, there's a recording popping on. Dans la langue de votre choix, but I think the presentation is going to be mostly in English. Um, and I'm very happy to introduce Professor Raywat Deonandan. I think he's known to most of you folks. He has been with us doing this presentation on COVID for, I think this is the third fall now, yes. And so we really appreciate him coming and taking time from his busy career as a professor at the University of Ottawa, an epidemiologist and science communicator, and specializing in global health. I wanted to ask you though, how much of that have you been, of your regular stuff have you been doing, or have you been mostly focused on COVID for?
Last 3 years, it's been 100% COVID, but I have a new research chair now on artificial intelligence. So that is my big pivot at this moment, and tapering off the COVID stuff. But that's the pivot. And most of the
Oh,
COVID work, frankly, has been in the legal realm. So being an expert witness on many, many, many court challenges.
will you get to testify about the Ottawa convoy stuff?
They haven't called me about that. No, a lot
Oh,
of stuff has to do with vaccine mandates, um, whether or not pandemic closures were justified. I can talk about this in the presentation if you like, but
yes.
we can do the
Sorry.
rest.
I will turn over. I'll stop my share, and I will. Where is it? Stop share and turn over the screen to you. And while you're talking, I'm just going to turn off my camera just so you don't see my weird head bobbing there while you're talking. And just for the folks who are listening, there is the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you want to use that. We'll probably, if it's okay, we'll take questions at the end, unless there's some kind of hot pursuit, in which case I'll pop up and ask you to if you can address it. And if since there's only a few of us, what we can do at the end is if you want to pose a question live, you can put up your hand and I can invite you to be a panelist so you can talk. But be aware that you will be recorded if that happens. So I will turn over the spotlight to you.
Thank you so much. First things first, my setup here is such that the camera is there against the wall, but my computer is down here. So if I'm looking at my slides, you get to see the top of my balding head. So I'm not being rude. This is how this works. And also, I'm not on a beach. This is a virtual background. And occasionally, this stealthy microphone appears. Don't let it be distracting. Third thing I want to mention is I'm recovering from a brutal ear infection. I'm deaf in this ear currently, and that's why I might be like turning around weirdly. Let's share my screen and we will begin the presentation. All right, you can all see this, right? So I've called this the state of the pandemic, whatever. Pamela and I had talked offline about the kinds of things people want to know about. Essentially, what we decided was people want to know what's going on. What's going on right now in October 2023 when it comes to COVID-19? And that's a big question. And I've gone through step by step to address what I think what's going on means. So, by the way, you can find me here at my website, mylastname.com. You probably all know that back in May of this year, the WHO declares an end to COVID-19 as a global health emergency. Now, that was misinterpreted by many in the media and among certain political circles to mean the pandemic is over. That's not what it meant. It just meant that it had moved to a different administrative category that permitted them to reallocate some funds in a different direction. When they're operating under emergency standards, there are strong requirements for data sharing, for resource allocation and so forth. Moving out of that means they can focus those resources in other areas because there are other diseases they have to deal with. And their logic, of course, was that we have tools that did not exist in 2020. Vaccination, some antivirals, more knowledge of the disease, and greater penetration of various kinds of immunity that makes this not the existential threat that it was in 2020. It's still an existential threat to individuals, some individuals who will likely suffer and die from this disease, but it's not an existential threat to society anymore as it was in 2020. So what is a pandemic? for people who misconstrued the WHO declaration with an end to pandemic. Epidemiologists actually have soft definitions of pandemic. So an epidemic is simply when a disease is more common than it otherwise would have been, specifically in a wide area like a nation. A pandemic is when an epidemic occurs in many places around the world. Note that this is about area and timing and not necessarily severity. These definitions have nothing to do with how serious the disease is, just how widespread it is and what time frame it's occurring under. The WHO has a bit more focused definition for its own administrative needs, like it must be occurring in multiple WHO regions, not just multiple parts of the world. And this is, again, to trigger certain administrative processes like releasing resources and demanding data sharing. So is it over? Well, in my opinion, no, and I'll explain why that is. But if you look at some global data, the signs are positive. For example, here we have the world's trends of new cases. Canada has the red line at the bottom, and the USA is this green line in between here. So this huge spike here that happened earlier this year, that's China. When China abandoned its I was going to say one child policy. It's COVID zero policy. They had an enormous spike in cases, and clearly that's driven much of the global burden. But in general, it looks as if the number of new cases per day is not as much as it was in 2021. However, I wouldn't trust this graph. And the reason is no one's testing anymore. No one's testing as much as we did in 2022, for example. So this is based on reported testing data. And if we're testing a tiny fraction of what we did back then, we're not capturing a lot of cases. Now, if you look back at where the hotspots were, the more red the area, the more cases per population are present. Earlier this year, USA, Eastern Europe, Japan, Australia were considered to be the hotspots. Now, not that many hotspots, frankly. Australia and Russia are still kind of pale, but in general, we're not looking at the same frantic emergency that we had earlier in the year. But cumulatively, that is over the entirety of the pandemic, we see that still it's Western Europe, Australia, the USA, India should be darker, I'm not sure why it isn't, and Southern Africa tend to be the places that have suffered the most in terms of number of cases. What about deaths? So I mentioned that we can't really trust the measurements of new cases because testing is not being done, but deaths are still occurring. And in most places of the world, deaths due to COVID are being recorded as such. If you look here, the United States is green, Canada is red, and the world is blue. And this is per million people. So this is rates. If you're wondering why the USA is higher than the world, it's because this is a relative measure, not an absolute measure. And yeah, the death rates seem to have dwindled as well. These are still high numbers. It's just that they're not as high as they used to be. And this is, of course, due to the amazing, miraculous power of vaccination, which just infuriates me no end when anti-vaxxers claim that the vaccine is causing this its own kind of pandemic, which is nonsense. The vaccine clearly saved the world, clearly, which is why the inventors of mRNA or the mRNA process of vaccination received the Nobel Prize this year. I believe they saved hundreds of millions of lives. What about hospitalizations? Well, if you look at Canada and the USA, well, something interesting is happening. The hospitalization rates are not as high as they were, let's say a year ago, but they are increasing. And this is the current wave that we're under. That's a lot of data that seems to be saying contradictory things. Globally, deaths and cases appear to be down. Locally, hospitalizations are up. That's because the pandemic is still here. But what we're looking at is a situation of hyperendemicity. One way to think about endemicity, an endemic disease, is that the waves used to go in and out. And when they're out, your feet are dry. Now, when an endemic disease, your ankles are always kind of wet. The waves still go in and out, but your ankles are always wet. With a hyper-endemic disease, your knees are always wet. And with COVID, it looks to be hyper-endemic. It's with us all the time at high levels, sometimes higher than others. And when it's higher, vulnerable people tend to be hospitalized and die more. So what we're seeing right here is the vulnerable being hospitalized. An important resource to consider is COVID-19resources.ca. This is run by Professor Tara Moriarty at U of T. She is a profound expert in modeling, in demographic extrapolation. And here she and her team are using the current data on infections, the healthcare system impact, and actual death rates to provide a composite score of how serious COVID is in various provinces. This is her most recent estimate, mid-October 2023. And we look around and we see Nova Scotia, really severe issues. Ontario, very severe. Everywhere in the country now, it's severe or very high. Alberta seems to be doing the best, and the best is not really good right now. So again, this is a compilation of those three measurements: infection rate, mortality rate, and impact on the healthcare system. Given that Canada has a lot less healthcare capacity than many other OECD nations, if this same analysis were applied to, say, Germany, it would look starkly different because the impact on their healthcare system would be less. But because we have so few beds to begin with, and a crisis in healthcare human resources, a tiny uptick in hospitalization rates due to COVID has a profound impact on our ability to manage those cases, which is why every time even a small wave arises, it's a cause for concern for those of us who deal in population health. Here is new infections, again, from Dr. Moriarty's group over the nation. This curve here is Alberta. I mentioned Alberta seems to be doing the best right now in the country. The nation, you're seeing up and downs over 2022, and now new infections are really climbing high. Now, this seems to be contrary to the graphs I showed you earlier. And the reason for that is this is due to modeling. It's estimated. Okay? So this includes things like wastewater data, as well as testing data, whereas the earlier graph just showed testing data. And as I said, you can't really trust that because not everybody's getting tested. We all know people who have COVID who aren't reporting it, who don't have a PCR test that ends up being reported to the government. If you take a rapid test and you're positive, nobody knows about it unless you tell them. If you get a PCR in a lab, then they have to report it. So the vast majority of people in Canada testing positive are being positive in rapid tests, and that is not entering a database anywhere. As a result, modeling studies tend to be a little more accurate in terms of number of new cases. Let's look at Ontario. In Ontario right now, we see that we had a very high number of cases in 2022. They've come down dramatically, but now we're increasing again. Not as bad as it was there, but up here. Again, based on testing data. I want to talk a little bit about kids now because there's some controversy about what it means for children. I have a small child. My child is 3 years old. He's in daycare. He doesn't wear a mask there. He has been vaccinated, but we're always concerned about exposure to COVID. I know that there are parents with COVID who send their kids to daycare anyway, because that's where we are now. And so it's only a matter of time, I think, before my kid is exposed. But so far, nobody in my family has had COVID, me, my wife, or my child. We're just sort of waiting for that to happen. Now, as I mentioned, there's a lot of contradictory information about COVID in kids. This is important to consider. COVID-19 is a leading cause of death in children and young people in the USA, and therefore in Canada as well. So this study here showed that in North America, COVID is the 8th biggest killer of kids per year. The number 1 biggest infectious disease killer of kids. That is scary, right? Do consider, though, that overall, the risk to kids is lower than to adults, significantly lower. It's just that so many more kids are being infected that a small percentage of a large number is a large number. That's where we're getting these issues here. And that's me trying to be fair to the data here. It's So people on both sides are correct. The risk to children is smaller, but it's not zero. And a vulnerable child is going to have a bad experience and hopefully not die from this. So I'm of the school of thought that we should be trying to prevent infection in schools as much as we can so that we don't get to these large numbers and therefore filling pediatric hospitals and having kids die. Kids aren't supposed to die. Yeah. So let's talk a bit now about the flu versus COVID. The BBC had a horrible article this past week saying that the flu is more lethal than COVID. So why are we still talking about COVID like it's serious? There's a lot wrong with that article. The way in which they did the math or reported on the math that was done is problematic. They compared one season of COVID to an entire season of the flu. The thing is, COVID doesn't have seasons. COVID goes out the entire year. So I'm going to present to you two quick studies here. There's a French study that showed that COVID, once you're hospitalized with COVID and the flu, you were 69% more likely to die if you had COVID. And that's more true if you're over 60 than if you're under 60. So this is the flu curve. This is the COVID curve. As you get older, you're far more likely to die. So once you're hospitalized, the risk of death from COVID is much worse. And a U.S. Veteran Affairs study found a similar thing. Once you're hospitalized, COVID had a 61% higher risk of death. And here you have some hazard ratios to look at, 61% higher. If you're older, it's dramatically more. So if you're over 65, it's 78% more likely that you're going to die of COVID. If you're under 65, they're kind of the same. The rates are kind of the same of death. So I don't have data on your probability of being infected. The thing is, vaccination has changed the game. So because everyone has had some degree of vaccination, your probability of being hospitalized with COVID is lower, especially now that you're a young person. Look here, though, amongst the unvaccinated, you're like twice as likely to die if you've been hospitalized with COVID than if you've been hospitalized with the flu. So vaccination has a huge, huge, huge impact. Let's talk a bit about surveillance now. I mentioned in the first couple of slides that we can't trust that data on the trend of new daily cases because no one's testing. A more objective way of looking at case of incidence rate is wastewater. If you don't know, that's when people poop into the toilets and the poop gets into the sewage system, and we test the sewage system to see the presence of COVID. And we do that relative to a benign virus that also waxes and wanes in the same way that COVID does in response to rainfall, things like that. So the process should be immune to perturbations caused by the environment. So the CDC has this data, this website you can go to look at their national wastewater surveillance. And you see right now, the redder areas are where we have more wastewater COVID. So the Northeast, the big urban centers in the Northeast, and some other parts peppered around the country. Now, you're probably thinking, well, I should move to Texas where it's safe then because there's no COVID there. Keep in mind that places like this don't have wastewater surveillance, so they do not appear on the graph. So do not mistake absence of data for absence of COVID. It's just that we know, for where we look, it seems to be quite high in the Northeast. Here we have in Ontario, you can go to Public Health Ontario's website and look at the composite wastewater signal in the province. And we see that it's not quite as high as it was in the end of 2022 when it was really, really high, but it's high. It's Ontario is in the throes of a COVID wave without question. But it might have peaked. And many of the monitors believe that we're at the peak right now and it'll come down again and it'll probably go up again a few weeks or months later. But right now it seems to be peaking. Here in Ottawa has a fantastic surveillance system. You can go to 613covid.ca/wastewater and it shows the same thing. It seems to have peaked already and we're projecting a down wave sometime next month. Okay. Still, it's a pretty high peak. Let's talk now about variants. it's important to talk about variants because the variants really, in my opinion, are what's driving the constant wave-like behavior of this disease. Why did immunity wane for so many people? Some people say it's because of limitations of the vaccine. Yeah, there's some of that. Some people say it's because it's impossible to have lasting immunity from a coronavirus. Maybe. But there's some strong suggestion that it has to do with the fact that new variants keep emerging, and these new variants have different virological profiles that challenge immunity in different ways. And in my opinion, had we managed to vaccinate the world back in early 2021, when we had a chance, I don't think we'd be looking at the same level of variant emergence, because variants emerge when they are allowed to infect a lot of people at once, and they can play around to find just the right combination of mutations that make our lives miserable. So the way that we categorize variants are VOI, VOC, and VOHC. VOIs are variants of interest, VOCs are variants of concern, and VOHC are variants of high consequence. And the way we distinguish between these categories is to look at the extent to which these variants compromise our ability to detect, prevent, and treat the disease. Detection is PCR test. Okay, does a PCR test still work? So far, it does. Does the vaccine prevent disease? Well, as we all know, not as much as it once did. And treatment. Do our treatments work? We don't have a lot of treatments. We have Paxlovid, we have some other antivirals. They've always been a little iffy. But you can think of the vaccine as a kind of treatment also, because it seems to prevent the worst aspects of the disease, hospitalization and death, and that still works very well. So we've had a lot of variants of interest. You haven't heard of them all. There are so many. The ones that make the news are variants of concern. You know, alpha, beta, delta, Omicron, and all its kids. We have had 0 variants of high consequence, 0. And that is excellent news. It means all our tools still work. We can still find it. We can still prevent it. We can still, to some extent, treat it. Will one emerge one day? Maybe, but so far not. So this seems to be what's driving our policy and our investigations into vaccines and treatments. So the variants we've had so far, to give you a quick recap of the last 3 years, in 2020, we had the original Wuhan strain. In 2020 as well, the UK variant that was later renamed Alpha popped up because it was first found in the UK. But doesn't mean it came from the UK. It could have gone somewhere else, but it was first detected in the UK. That same year, Beta arose, and Beta was first detected in South Africa. That same year, Delta was detected in India. Now, even though it was detected in these years, they didn't really express their strengths until the next year. In 2021, Omicron was detected in South Africa. Cast your mind back. When we got the vaccines in late 2020, there was a great hallelujah moment. We all thought this is the beginning of the end. Fantastic. We started vaccinating everyone. The math suggested we can reach herd immunity by the spring of 2021. Delta popped up around then, was not dominant until the summer of 2021. With Delta, the math became fuzzier, but by the fall of 2021, we had stopped most transmission in long-term care centers. Vaccination was still working really well, and the vaccine passport system, in my opinion, was also working well because of the power of the vaccine. When Omicron came around at the end of 2021, that changed everything, because Omicron was allowing a lot more breakthrough infections. And as a result, the vaccines could no longer be allowed or assumed to be preventing symptomatic disease as much as it did in the past. It was still preventing hospitalization and death to a large extent, but not symptomatic disease. So that has caused us to enter this new era where we expect to be infected, but we don't expect to be hospitalized and to be dead. Before Omicron and Delta, we didn't even expect to be infected because of the vaccines. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a second. So now everything is Omicron. Pretty much every variant in the world is a version of Omicron. It has supplanted almost everything else. So let's do a quick recap of the various lineages. Omicron had some kids. Those kids include the BA line of variants. BA2, BA4, BA5, they're all BA. BA had some kids. Those kids include XBB, XBB 1.5, 1.6. There's so many XBBs, but that's XBB is a grandchild of Omicron. XBB had some kids, including the EG line, EG.5 being most common. BA had some other kids, most famously BA286. So BA286 and XBB are cousins. They're closely related. Right now, as I will show you, in Canada, EG5 seems to be the dominant variant. BA286 has virologists concerned because it has a lot of mutations. And the more mutations, the higher likelihood of compromising prevention, detection, and treatment. It doesn't seem to be doing that. The biggest concern is that BA286 will mutate into something else, will have some kids, and will then take on more troubling characteristics. Now, in Ontario right now, this is a scary graph. If you look at, these are weeks of the year, it's EG5 was very dominant recently, but we have a bunch of new variants popping up now. This is the norm now, like variant soup. It used to be one or two variants were dominating everything. Now a soup of variants that keep on emerging. This is a different visualization of what's happening in Ontario. We have EG5 is dominant, but it's dwindling. We have these orange ones that are increasing, different versions of EG. So it's still mostly an EG scenario, landscape. Remember, EG is a child of XBB. XBB is a child of Omicron. This is a clearer graph. This shows comparing Canada and the USA. This is all EG5. So in Canada, 45% of cases that have been sequenced. Let's back up. How does this work? If you go to the hospital with COVID, serious COVID, or if you're a healthcare worker and get a PCR test, a fraction of those PCR tests will undergo further genomic analysis. And those will tell us the fraction that are certain variants. So not everybody gets tested this way, just a fraction of a fraction. But we can statistically extrapolate to get a sense of what the likely landscape looks like. So in Canada, as I mentioned, 45% at the end of September were EG5. In the US, that would be 34%. But these other variants are in the mix also, and this is in flux all the time. So that brings us to the vaccines. In the original vaccine that was out in 2020 was targeted solely to the Wuhan variant because that's what they had to work with. We didn't anticipate variants emerging. In 2022, the bivalent booster came out. Remember that? And that had targeting to both the Wuhan variant and BA1. Now, that same year, a different booster came out that was targeted to both the Wuhan variant and BA4, BA5. So, both BAs. And that was thought to be, better matched to the circulating variants. The problem is by the time they came out, BA wasn't dominant anymore. XBB was dominant. So we're losing the chase the variant contest. Now in 2023 now, the new monovalent boosters come. Monovalent because it doesn't have the Wuhan strain. It just has one thing targeted, and it's targeting XBB 1.5, which was dominant a few months ago. But as you see now, EG5 is dominant. However, EG5 is closely related to XBB. As a result, there's every expectation that the new monovalent booster will perform better in the current landscape than the bivalent booster will, simply because it's better matched to the circulating variants. Even though XBB is not around as much, XBB's kids are around. That's good enough. So in other words, the current lab studies show that there is significant antibody production targeted to EG5 and BA2 when blood samples of people vaccinated with the new monovalent are exposed to these variants. And this suggests that the new vaccine will provide better protection than the bivalents against the current variants. What does better mean? Better chance of keeping you out of the hospital, better chance of keeping you out of the morgue, and frankly, a better chance of preventing symptoms altogether. And if you prevent symptoms altogether, that's a better chance of preventing transmission, which is why I think this vaccine has a good chance of getting us closer to normal, of the sense that we saw back in 2021 than we've seen in some time. So a lot of people are skittish about mRNA vaccines for reasons I don't fully understand. But there are a lot of non-mRNA options out there if you don't want an mRNA vaccine. I mean, some people do report some autoimmune issues with mRNA vaccines. That does occur in rare cases. So the most popular non-mRNA version is Novavax. Novavax, to my knowledge, has not yet been licensed in Canada, the monovalent version. It will be soon because it has been approved by FDA. And when that happens, maybe in a month or two, it'll be available in drugstores in Canada. I like the Novavax vaccine a lot. It seems to have a slightly broader spectrum immunity. It's certainly robust. So if I had a chance, I'd jump at it because I've had all mRNA up to now, and I like the idea of a heterologous boost. A heterologous boost is when you're boosted by a vaccine that's slightly different from the previous one. And that gives your immune system a different perspective, right? And that tends to be a little more robust kind of immunity. Nothing wrong with being boosted with the same thing, but being boosted with different things tends to be a little bit better. So Covaxin and Incovac are common in India, and these are non-mRNA vaccines. Incovac is actually an inhaled mucosal vaccine, which I will talk about in a second. But it was developed at the University of Washington, but no one in the West wanted it. The Indians snatched it up, and they are giving it to their citizens. AstraZeneca famously is a non-mRNA vaccine, which is no longer available in the West due to its reputation for increasing of clots, which is quite dangerous. Sputnik V is available in Russia, and Sputnik V is kind of the same as AstraZeneca. Cuba has some interesting homemade vaccines, Abdala and Mambisa. Mambisa is also inhaled. We don't know a lot about that, but they have developed these indigenously, and they have managed their pandemic quite well. So make of that what you will. China has CoronaVac and Sinopharm, and a version of them that is also inhaled. And Iran has one called Coviran Barket, which I don't know a lot about. And there are other ones, floating. Dr. Peter Hotez in Texas developed a pediatric COVID vaccine that he has given to the world for free. And I don't know a lot about it, but knowing Dr. Hotez, I'm sure it's effective. And we should talk more about that in the future, I think. Better vaccines are coming. That should really give us a lot more comfort and a lot more confidence in going out into the world. And I'm talking here about what we call mucosal vaccines. A mucosal vaccine is one that triggers an immunogenic reaction in the mucosa, like your nose and your pharynx and your mouth. Think about it like bouncers at a nightclub. There are always troublemakers going in nightclubs, starting fights and stuff. If you find them inside the nightclub, you've got to work hard to get them out and toss them into the street. On the other hand, if you can prevent them from getting in the first place, well, that's much easier. A mucosal vaccine is like a bouncer in the nightclub of your body. Not the best metaphor, but there it is. Coffee time. So if you can elicit an immunogenic reaction in your mucosa, you prevent the virus from getting further into your system. And there's a lot of data that suggests that this works quite well. So there are many, many, many candidates underway looking at whether or not we can develop a COVID mucosal vaccine of high effectiveness. And in fact, the US government has awarded $500 million to study this process. Thank goodness, because one of the biggest barriers to moving ahead with vaccines is money. The biggest reason we got the COVID vaccines as fast as we did was Project Warp Speed threw a lot of money at it. And that allows drug companies to just run a lot of clinical trials in parallel. And hopefully this will happen here as well, because we have some really interesting candidates for mucosal vaccines. We do have existing mucosal vaccines around the world. As I mentioned, India has Incovac. And there's no data, though, on whether or not it prevents transmission. There is data about whether or not it prevents hospitalization and death. It does. It performs as well, if not better, than its injected intramuscular version. Cuba, as I mentioned, has Mambisa. China has their CanSino version, and Iran has a new one, Razi Kofpars. Again, no data. No one's sharing their trial data if they have any. So I don't know. We talked about Cuba, so let's look at Cuba's COVID performance. Look at new cases per million. Canada is in the red, Cuba's in the blue. It looks like it's down to 0. New deaths looks like it's down to 0. So Cuba, if you believe these data, has tamed the pandemic in their borders using a variety of public health measures and vaccination. Again, if you trust these data, which I mostly do, but not entirely. India, similar story. They appears to have tamed much of their pandemic. These are rates, per million. The actual raw numbers of people with COVID and dying of COVID are going to be much higher because India has such a higher population. But in terms of the size of their population, their rates seem to be less than Canada. Again, I don't trust the new cases because of testing limitations. And the deaths also, the data is going to be a little iffy. But the fact that they've got these inhaled vaccines has allowed them to offer immunity to more people faster. The other advantage of an inhaled vaccine is you can store it, you can transport it. People who are afraid of needles don't need to be. It's good for kids. Non-experts can deliver them. A parent can give it to the child. Doesn't have to be a nurse or a doctor. So you can easily see this can be transformative for much of the world. A quick note about masks. You're going to hear a lot of nonsense about masks. There are a couple of problematic studies suggesting that masks don't work to slow things down. Of course they work. Of course they work. I can go over in minute detail why those studies are so bad, but I'm not going to waste your time that way. There's plenty of much better evidence showing that, of course, masks work. Not perfectly. The idea behind a mask is a mask lowers the time or increases the time it takes for you to become infected. If you go into a room full of COVID-infected people who are coughing, you're going to get infected eventually if you stay there long enough. If you're wearing a mask, you can stay there longer. If you're wearing the best mask in the world, if you spend enough time there, you're going to get infected eventually. Okay, so a mask extends the time that it takes for you to become infected. And the better quality mask, the longer time it takes. So how do I personally gauge risk at the moment? Well, as I mentioned, I have a small child in daycare, so I'm bringing in risk into my house every single day that he comes home. But how do I gauge risk in general? I look at the local wastewater levels. If they are high, I know to be more careful. If they are low, then I will go to a restaurant. Absolutely, if it's not too crowded. But if it's high, nope, no way. I look at the hospitalization levels, much like Dr. Moriarty does. If the hospitals are being challenged, then I don't have a lot of confidence that if my child gets sick, someone's going to be there to take care of him. So I try my best to prevent infection from entering this house. Consider my personal circumstance. Do I have an immunocompromised person to take care of? I don't. So I can take a few more additional risks in my life than otherwise would. And as I mentioned, I feel that I should be taking the same risks that my child does. So my child is going to like a petri dish of a daycare center. So I should, not go that far, but be confident enough that I should be modeling behavior of risk-taking with him. Something like that. That didn't come out right. Something like that. And look at the characteristics of the environment. So how well ventilated is an area? How crowded is it? So I always wear an N95 respirator in a high risk setting, like a hospital. That is not going to change for me. Even if COVID has been wiped out, it's pretty clear that hospitals at the moment are nosocomial infection factories. You don't want to bring anything weird home. So the rate of nosocomial infection, of hospital-acquired COVID infection right now is really quite high. So if you're going to go to a hospital or a clinic or something, just wear a mask. That's where sick people go. If you go to encounter someone with COVID, it's going to be at a hospital. So wear a mask. And wear a good mask, an N95 or a KN95. Those surgical masks, they do something. They're not useless, but they're not as good. I would consider wearing a respirator in crowded indoor settings, classrooms, book readings at a book club, places like that. especially when the wastewater levels are high. Right now, if I go grocery shopping, I don't wear a mask. I go when it's not crowded. Grocery stores, in my experience, have good ventilation, high ceilings. I don't go near people. And so I have reason that the probability of transmission is low. This is something I've spoken to my family about, and we agree. We decided to take those risks as a group. But if I'm going at peak hours and it's quite crowded and I got to wait in line, I will wear a mask and get the new vaccine if you are eligible. I recommend it. I intend to do so as soon as I can. That is the last of my slides. So lay it on me if there are any questions or bad
Whoa,
jokes.
thank you very much. Yeah, I'm particularly glad to hear your calculation of how you figure out what you're willing to do and not do. I mean, I think we all know, we all know people at both extreme ends of things, right? Like people
Yeah.
who are just like pretending nothing exists, and others who still, have not returned to much
We have to
social.
respect those people in particular because you don't know their circumstance. They there are people who refuse to go anywhere, like grocery stores or restaurants, and who wear double masks all the time. They may be cancer patients. They may be immune compromised. We have to respect it. And I'm always happy when I'm wearing a mask and some asshole like wants to pick an argument saying, "Why are you wearing a mask?" My I haven't had to use this response yet, but my bottled response is, "Oh, because I have COVID. Should I cough on you?" See how they react. So, but no one's challenged me yet. But I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's true. But I don't understand some of the psychology of some of these things, right? Like I as far as I know, because I haven't been testing obsessively if I haven't had symptoms, as far as I know, I have not had COVID yet, and I know that I recognize that you're probably not going to be able to prevent it forever. But it's interesting because sometimes the reaction of some people is almost anger. Like, who do you
Yeah.
think you are to
Yeah.
think that you are not going to have?
Yeah. I mean that we're into the realm of social psychology now, which is not my area. But this pandemic has been instructive in plowing the depths of human fragility, of how I had to suffer, therefore you must suffer. Or deep down, I'm kind of scared of what this means. So I want the experience to be shared as widely as I can so that we can dilute my fear. I think that's what's going on to some extent. There is a question here from Madeline asking
Yes.
about long COVID figures. So again, this is controversial. I've seen estimates anywhere from 0.5% to 10% of infections resulting in long COVID. It's probably around 1% to 2%, depending on how you define long COVID. So most studies are defining it as 45 days of lingering symptoms, 45 days after the resolution of primary symptoms. That's probably a weak definition. Others are suggesting we define it as 3 months past the resolution of primary symptoms. It probably should be like 3 months or more. Probably should be, defining what those symptoms are. The issue with some of the estimates is that it's self-reported, and some of the reports are really vague, like I don't feel myself, or I'm just like I can't really. I have these anxieties, and reporting anxieties as long COVID might be relevant, or they might not be. It's too subjective. We don't yet have a blood test for long COVID, even though there's a couple of studies suggesting there may be onto something there. That's a roundabout way of saying a lot of work needs to be done still on long COVID. It's real. Absolutely, it's real. Some people's fatigue levels, chronic fatigue is crippling. I have students who got infected in 2020 who are nationally ranked athletes who still can barely climb the stairs today.
Wow.
So it does happen. Absolutely. Is some of it psychological? I think in some cases it is, not all. We have to distinguish those ones. There does seem to be evidence that vaccination reduces the probability of long COVID if you had a breakthrough infection, because it's probably related to viral load. So the more sick you were, the more likely you are to have long COVID. So a milder infection is less likely to result in long COVID, and vaccinated people are more likely to have milder infections. Paxlovid seems to reduce the likelihood as well. So if you get infected and get Paxlovid, there is some data suggesting that you have a lesser chance of either intense long COVID or lengthy long COVID. Metformin seems to be a treatment option also. Metformin is a diabetes drug, and it seems to be a treatment option. There's a lot we don't know about. Does it actually work? When should it be given? Can it be given prophylactically? How long must it be given? All these things very much unknown. So this is a brand new field that needs to be explored fully. It's a reason, though, to take seriously a desire not to be infected. Also controversially is, are you more likely to get long COVID with multiple infections? Some people are claiming that the data suggests that multiple infections reduces the chances. Others say that, of course not. With every new infection, your probability of getting it it mounts. Again, the data needs to be parsed. I've not looked closely at the data to give you a solid answer there. These are some of the things we got to consider.
See, Madeline had her hand up there. I think maybe she has a follow-up question.
Please, yeah.
Sorry, thanks. You actually answered it. That was my question, is where do reinfections fit in with that risk?
Yeah, common wisdom would suggest that every reinfection offers an additional risk of long COVID. On the other hand, so many people are being reinfected at the moment that you think we'd see an avalanche of long COVID cases, but maybe we are. Maybe we are seeing it. It's just not reflecting in policy yet. For example, Sweden is showing a significantly higher number of parents taking time off from work to take care of sick kids now than before the pandemic. So kids in Sweden appear to be getting sicker, more so, requiring care at home. They're not going to the hospital, but they're bad enough that their parents have to take time off work. Now, is this reflective of some new employee policy I'm unaware of? Possibly. This has to be investigated further. But that's the kind of signal that is suggestive of something happening. We have more sick days being used in the USA across the board. Is that a social change, or is that the result of long COVID manifesting subclinically? Unclear. That's the kind of investigation that needs to be done. So there are different ways of doing so. Looking at, again, clinical data, hospitalization data, which is always the go-to, but I think doesn't capture the fullness of what we want, or looking at social level data of people's behaviors, which I think is more accurate, because most cases will not result in a trip to the doctor. They will result in measurable economic impact. And this will be 5, 10, 15, 20 years of investigation before we have anything resembling an answer. As a result, my feeling is, let's try our best not to get infected, which is why I recommend the new monovalent vaccine and strategic mask wearing until mucosal vaccine is available.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's what was going to be my question was, where do you see, or when do you see this ever ending? I mean, is it just going to be like colds that are out there in different forms?
That's a really good question. No one's got a crystal ball, but here's some possibilities. The Asiatic flu, or the Russian flu of 1890, was one of the most lethal respiratory pandemics in modern era. We don't know what caused it. There is strong consideration it was caused by a coronavirus. I think OC43 is the name of that coronavirus. I could be wrong about the name of it. I'm not pretty good with memorizing labels. And we think that's the case because some of the symptoms included loss of taste and smell, right? Ooh. So it sounds like a coronavirus, right? Here's the thing about that particular coronavirus. It is now one of the handful of coronaviruses and rhinoviruses that cause the common cold. In other words, a lethal pandemic strain of a virus has now become the common cold. So some virologists think what we're looking at here is the emergence of a common cold decades from now. So that might be the case, due to a combination of the population retaining immunity and mutations of the virus to become something a little less problematic. So that's possibly where it's going. A mucosal vaccine really changes the game a lot, if in fact it does offer protection against transmission. And I'm hopeful that it does, because the animal and lab data It's quite promising at the moment. And if we get it into enough noses, transmission drops dramatically, then so few people get infected every year that it's not something worth talking about anymore. Is it a one and done? Possibly. Or maybe once every couple of years you get a nasal spray, which is not a hardship to undertake. And if it's possible to get a transmission minimizing vaccine, then it's possible to maybe eliminate the disease. Now, when we talk about elimination, there's control, there's elimination, there's eradication, and there's extinction. That's how we think about infectious diseases. Extinction is when we wipe it off the face of the earth. Eradication is when we wipe it off the face of the earth, except for some laboratory samples. So 2 viruses have been eradicated by humans, smallpox and rinderpest. Both exist in labs. No virus, to my knowledge, has been rendered extinct by humans, to my knowledge. Elimination, polio was eliminated. We push it outside our national borders. It still exists in the world. We can control it so well it doesn't pop up in our country. And control is what we kind of have now. Is it pops up all the time. We stifle it with public health measures and hospitalization and so forth. We have a poor level of control at the moment. I think with a good enough mucosal vaccine, we can get to an almost elimination stage with rabies and polio and things like that. So that's definitely in the cards if you play our cards correctly.
Excellent. So we have another question from Michelle about implications for seniors, people with parents.
Yes. So obviously, this is the population at greatest risk. The mortality rate's really quite high of this population. And so my mother's over 84 and high risk as well, has had COVID twice already. And so I'm always concerned about it. I really advocate for these people to be careful. So in times of high COVID, as we have right now, wear a mask. Maybe consider getting a flow mask. These are more expensive masks that are more comfortable, and you can they're reusable. You just buy filters and shove them in. I might get one for.
Is that the one with the hole on the side?
They're different kinds of flow masks, but they're far more comfortable. They don't fog up your glasses, and for being on planes and stuff like that. So I might get one just for travel purposes. So for seniors, it's a tough call because you got to live your life. You got to see your grandkids. You got to go out as well. If you're immunocompromised, it's even harder. Wearing a mask strategically will help a lot. Not an important thing I didn't talk about is not being around people with symptoms. That is such an easy thing to enact that has a huge impact. It is possible to transmit asymptomatically, absolutely. It's just much less likely. So just stay away from people who are sneezing and coughing and who have obvious symptoms, and your probability of being exposed comes down dramatically. This is all about probability. So reduce your probability of exposure, reduce your probability of receiving a viral load of some kind by wearing a mask, reduce your probability of having a bad outcome by being vaccinated, and reduce your probability of other bad outcomes by being fit. There's some things we can do as individuals, just reduce your body weight, be a fitter individual, eat healthier. Those are longer term investments. There's some victim blaming there, I'm aware, but we do have some responsibility to take care of ourselves as much as we can. And definitely be up to date with your vaccines. That's probably the highest impact thing you can do right away. Navigating the social situation is harder. There are going to be people in your life who don't take your risks seriously. We all have them in our lives, right? You have people, visiting family in the hospital, and so why? And other family members are demanding I take my mask off for a photograph. No, no, I'm not going to. That's stupid. So it's a tough one. But the implications are real. And questions I'm often asked is, well, can I go grocery shopping? Yeah, you can go grocery shopping. Just choose a time when it's not crowded. Wear a good mask. And go enjoy yourself. Can I go to a movie theater? I don't go to movie theaters right now. I don't really feel comfortable, but you probably can. Just go when it's not crowded and wear a mask. Can you do indoor dining? Well, that's, the risk level goes up. One of the things you can consider doing if you really care about this is to get a CO2 monitor. What a CO2 monitor does, it allows you to gauge the level of outdoor air entering the environment. And it measures CO2 in, I've forgotten the units, nanoparticles per million, something like that. And you want a number hovering around 500, because that's what the CO2 levels in the outdoor air are like. If it's higher than that, then you know that you're rebreathing other people's exhalations. So you want to keep rebreathing to a minimum. Invest in a HEPA filter. I have one running in my office right now. You can't hear it. It's on maximum. People complain they're too loud. I can barely hear mine. HEPA filters work. You know, it's funny. You look at what the wealthiest people do and model that. So in Davos, what do they have? They've got mandatory testing. They've got HEPA filters. They've got high quality masks. It's good enough for them. It's good enough for us. Private schools have HEPA filters in all the classrooms. They have minimal COVID infection in private schools. Why is that not good enough for public schools? You know, it's good enough for you and me. So if you can afford a HEPA filter in your office or home, that works. Definitely.
That was one of the things we did in our PAFSO office, was got extra, well, and supposedly our building management, set up extra protections, but we put HEPA filters in every office. And
buildings, the building filter, it's called a MERV system, MERV. It can only go so high. The experts say anything like 13 above can filter out viral particles. Yeah, but how often is it being recirculated? Anything above that tends to stress the HVAC system too much. The air pressure drops. So a lot of buildings can't handle the kinds of filtration you get in hospitals. Hospitals have HEPA, but you can get a portable HEPA for the room that you're in. And that solves the problem. There are these devices called Corsi-Rosenthal boxes that people can make at home. That was all the rage a couple of years ago. They've fallen out of fashion because they've been mocked by COVID minimizers, which is unfortunate because you can build one for $100 or so. Or go to Amazon and get a HEPA filter. That's quite stylish. It sits in the corner, makes no noise.
do they have little ones that you can carry around with you?
Yes, I don't trust that. You will find all kinds of snake oil salesmen selling things you can hang around your neck, essentially fans blowing air in your face. They don't do anything. You can get far UV devices. So far ultraviolet radiation emitters do sterilize the area around you. They're really expensive, and they're still being developed by engineers. So there's a few I've seen in various trade shows, like worn over your head, these lamps in a room that really very quite effective at killing all virus around you and don't have an effect on human beings, negatively, I mean, but quite expensive. I think that's probably the future. The next, if we really take this seriously, in the next 10 years, investments in far UV technology. But the kind of stuff you'll find on Amazon to wear around your neck and carry around, I don't think that's effective.
No. Interesting. Well, it's interesting how many different changes this has brought about in society. The whole work from home, remote work thing, becoming a lot more normalized. And, honestly, for us at PAFSO, I would say like it's been a positive in the sense that it's, forced us to come to terms with doing things a lot more remotely.
Yeah.
And for example, had better attendance at most of our events and a lot more participation from members abroad. They feel a lot more included. I mean, we're starting to try to go back and have, our goal is to have one in-person event like per quarter, to try to bring people together, because there are those social consequences, right. Especially when they do a big recruitment of new people and they don't have a chance to meet with each other and so on. But I think it's been good. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, doing expert witness stuff about on these things. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I know you can't.
I can talk about the ones that are resolved. And I've been on both sides.
What's the trends there that you're seeing?
So originally, my first one was for, I represent an airline. I was on, okay, technically, as many of you know, because many of you are lawyers, an expert witness is a witness for the court. I don't take a side, but you're paid by one side. So they're not going to pay you unless you're
one finds you, right?
One finds you, and your views match theirs, so they will pay to have you there. But I'm advising, the court. My first one was an airline was being sued by an airport. The airline refused to operate during the worst of COVID, and the airport was saying, it's fine, you should open because we're losing money every day. And they refused to open. And so I was brought in to show that if you open, X number of people will get sick. and it's an untoward amount of stress on the system. My next one was for a series of gyms. Same thing. The landlords were suing the gyms to open, and the gyms did not want to open because they were being responsible. I did some modeling showing if they were to open in this community, this is what it would mean for infection rates. The vaccine question has really changed the game. So I've been brought on both sides with the vaccine question by unions and employers alike, and challenging mandates and supporting mandates. So it depends on why the mandate was put in place and when it was put in place. And that dictates my opinion on the matter. So if you're talking about, prior to the arrival of Omicron, a 2-dose vaccine mandate made perfect sense, in my opinion, to control transmission. After Omicron, it makes less sense. A 3rd dose makes more sense again. Keeping up to date with vaccination makes a lot of sense. I will defend that as a policy. However, I think if you are making your employees have 2 doses of an old vaccine in the era of Omicron and its descendants for the purposes of controlling transmission, there is not a lot of justification for that. On the other hand, if the mandate is to prevent the employees from getting seriously sick, hospitalized, and die, yeah, there's justification for that too. So the courtroom work tends to be very specific on the question being asked, and
so how were those? Do you know how were those cases resolved? Like the gym?
Many resolved. I lose almost all of them. I'm brought on by the losing side almost all the time. There's a fun one that I talk about as much as I can. This is a murder case, and I was brought on because the defense side wanted to move the trial online. This was in the throes of the Delta epidemic, and they felt that it was unsafe for the jurors and for the lawyers in particular, because one was being compromised, to be compelled to be present. And I agreed with them. You should do it online. The prosecutors did not want it to be online because they felt they were at disadvantage in terms of, their intimidation cross examination techniques. I have no idea. Anyway, my argument was vaccination alone will not keep the courtroom infection free, because it's an airborne virus and you need a better quality mask than people are being asked to wear. And there aren't enough filters in this room to accommodate that process. The other side brought on their expert who argued that COVID was not airborne. COVID is airborne. I think the data for that is pretty strong now. And it was strong back then too. Interestingly, the expert they brought on represented Public Health Ontario. In other words, Public Health Ontario argued with me in a court of law that COVID is not airborne. And I will never forget that. When it was clear that it was airborne. We lost.
I mean, that kind of thing is, some of the long-term damage that, society, I think, is going to have to come to terms with, right? Yeah. Hearing people argue things that are just not common sense, So on both, sometimes on both sides, both extremes, I think sometimes, but yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what to say. It's we have to be humble and recognize that, things change. The vaccine question is challenging because it depends on how you look at the data justifying mandates and things like that. But to me, it's all about the time frame. When are you justifying it? And what are you justifying? 2 doses of what? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it still could be interesting again in the federal government, because the mandate has not been stopped. It's just been, the policy has just been put on hold. Right. The policy is still in place, but is just not, they're not checking into it right now. So they could come back and say, well, okay, all of you guys all have to get the new booster.
And I think that's fantastic. I'm fully in favor. It's so funny because I've been insulted by both sides of the argument, saying, how can you defend the I'm not defending the anti-vaxxers. I'm saying get more vaccines. You can't defend a policy with limited vaccination. The policy should be get vaccinated more.
Yeah. No, it'll be interesting. I mean, yeah, I despite being, team give me all the vaccines you can get and believing in it, I do see the argument, that there are certain precedents in terms of, people's bodily autonomy.
Yes.
and
So
on.
I'll add that in my expert witness testimonies, I always add that we should accommodate those who
Yes.
don't want. And here are opportunities for accommodation, including daily testing, including at your own expense, including mask wearing. These are things that are done in healthcare all the time. And I put forth the math for what daily testing would look like. And in fact, in many cases, daily testing, in my opinion, can be more effective than a 2-dose mandatory vaccine. So,
well, and also if we get different types of vaccines, right, that
right.
Might.
Madeline has a question.
The concern, Madeline, go ahead.
Sorry, always the nerd with the epi questions. What you get when you get an epi degree. There's been and this is shifting course a little bit from the current conversation, but there's been something that was raised recently, a conversation around reconsidering hygiene hypothesis and the idea that exposure to bacteria has a different type of effect overall compared to exposure to
the viruses.
Virus. And the reason I ask this is because, I mean, I'm trying to read between the lines and understanding public health policy, and you've said it there, and I'm not sure how long ago that case was for you and whether or not they've moved the dial, but it feels like the underlying rationale is everybody just needs to get this a whole bunch and then we'll all be immune to it. And there's anyway.
I'm careful not to overstep my expertise. I'm not a virologist, and I've asked a similar question online to virologists, and I got like a lot of responses. Here is the long and short of my understanding of the reaction. If you don't know, the hygiene hypothesis is too much cleanliness is bad for your immune system. That's mostly about bacteria. So we all have bacteria living in our bodies and our gut flora, which are critical to our mental health, our physical health, our immune health. Bacteria are really important. Bacteria can also kill you, right? So you don't want tuberculosis, for example. Viruses, it's less clear that you want viruses. Yeah, there's a good portion of our DNA is in fact made up of ancient viral infection. In fact, I've seen a theory that the human placenta was developed in response to viral infection. So historically, there's probably some benefits. On the other hand, you don't want repeated exposure to the HIV virus for your health. You don't want repeated exposure to polio for your health. You don't want repeated exposure to hepatitis for your health. There are many instances where simply throwing the doors open, say, hey, infect me, is more than not going to kill you. All right. Now, if you want healthy bacteria, just sleep with the windows open.
Get a dog.
Yeah, get a dog to lick your face. I remember early on with the mask mandate, people were so concerned. If I'm wearing a mask, I'm not going to get my health. Well, you're not sleeping in your mask, are you? You're not going home and eating you're going home and being with your family with your mask off, with your pets. You're going for long walks in the open air with your mask off. You're going to get your bacteria dose anyway. Don't worry about your bacteria dose. It's going to come unless you're like wiping down surfaces all the time and adding antibiotics to your foods. Right? If you're a hyper hygienic individual, you're going to get your bacterial dose. You eat lots of fiber. But this particular virus, the argument is just get it all the time and become immune that way. Maybe. I mean, there's always that possibility. You got to give them the possibility of it. It just seems unlikely because how's that working out for the flu? You get the flu all the time. Are you immune to the flu now? Clearly not. I can get a common cold all the time. You're still getting more colds. It doesn't make you immune. Now, in fact, people are getting COVID more frequently than before. It used to be you get COVID, you're immune for like a few months. Now, people are getting reinfected in under 45 days, in some cases under 30 days. The interval between reinfections is shortening. It's unclear why that is. It could be because new variants are emerging that are so different that you're infected with one variant one day, then a few weeks later, infect with a second variant that doesn't respect your immunity. So that might mean you're sick year round all the time. Doesn't sound like a fun way to live to me. I don't know. It's a virological question, not an epidemiological one. I have opinions, but they may not be expert opinions. So that's the best I could offer.
Wow. Well, thank you. It's I'm just looking, I'm not seeing any other questions. If anybody else has another question or wants to be promoted to a panelist to ask anything, now's your chance. Madeline, do you have any last comments or anything before we
I love
go?
Madeline's questions. She's got the best
Yes.
questions.
No,
Okay.
are you saying no? You're muted.
Yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay.
Super interesting,
Excellent.
and I really appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. We appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us and make this all understandable because it is, still we're getting a lot of contradictory information, and it's hard for those of us without science brains like me to parse all of it. So we really appreciate your willingness to come and share your celebrity and your expertise with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. My caveat is always, we have to respect our expertise limitations. Mine is in reading data and understanding epidemiology. So sometimes I'm asked to talk about virological issues. I'm not a virologist. I have some basic understanding, but I try to cite the opinions of others as best I can. If I'm wrong, please correct me. Let me know.
Well, I doubt any of us are in a position to correct you for sure, but we definitely, sorry, I'll just turn the recording off.
Okay.
Stop recording. We